The shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz was not quite as bad as you probably thought. In retaliation for the US and Israel strikes on Iran, the country's Sepah Navy broadcast the following message over VHF Marine Radio: "From now on, all navigating through the Strait of Hormuz is forbidden. No ship of any type is allowed to pass until further notice." To back up that declaration, the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps attacked vessels with missiles and drones, sending a clear message to others and grinding traffic to a halt. It's also true that 20% of the world's oil passed through this choke point up until the war. But global oil production in March 2026 actually only shrank about 8%. Prices, however, spiked a massive 60%, 7.5 times more than the contraction in supply. This is perhaps counterintuitive, but how this happened and what happens next is explained by the full complexity of the global oil markets. The Gulf is undoubtedly the world's most important oil production region. It has both the greatest reserves and the lowest cost of production, making it no surprise that it quickly developed into one of the world's greatest concentrations of wealth. The smallest country on the waterway, Bahrain, no larger than the city of New York, outputs about 200,000 barrels a day. Its economy is fairly diversified, focusing on refining Saudi oil, manufacturing, and finance. Neighboring Qatar produces 1.3 million barrels a day, and its Ras Laffan industrial city is single-handedly responsible for 20% of the world's liquid natural gas supply. Then there's Kuwait, the world's 10th largest producer at 2.6 million barrels a day, where oil completely dominates the economy. These three nations were each 100% reliant on tankers transiting the strait to export their product, devastating for them. But they collectively represent just 16% of Gulf production, so their influence on global prices is minimal. The WEI produces 4.1 million barrels a day, more than those three combined. Crucially, it has a small coastline on the other side of the strait. In 2008, knowing Iran could realistically close the waterway, it's only 20 miles wide with narrow shipping lanes, the WEI built a pipeline to the port of Fujairah on the other side. Iran itself built a similar contingency pipeline to the port of Jask, capable of handling roughly 15% of normal exports. Iraq has a pipeline routed through Kurdistan to a port in Turkey, bypassing both Hormuz and the Suez Canal. Though it's been mostly non-operative due to political disputes between Baghdad and Kurdistan, an agreement was struck weeks into the war, with the potential to carry 600,000 barrels a day. Saudi Arabia, the Gulf's dominant producer, built its 750-mile east-west pipeline after the Iran-Iraq War, capable of moving up to 5 million barrels a day to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Together, these routes significantly cushioned the blow. Even a drip feed of Iranian and allied tankers was still getting through the strait, so the 8% production drop, while serious, was smaller than headlines suggested. Which raises the central question: why did 8% less supply cause 60% higher prices? The answer lies in one of the most important concepts in economics: the elasticity of demand. It measures how much consumer behavior changes in response to price. Breakfast cereal, for example, has an elasticity of around -3. A 10% price rise leads to a 30% drop in demand because people simply switch brands or eat something else. There are substitutes everywhere. Oil is the opposite. 3/4 of personal vehicle trips are non-discretionary commuting, groceries, medical visits, school runs. These don't stop because fuel gets expensive. And personal vehicles are only about 1/4 of total global oil consumption. The rest is commercial, trucking networks, cargo shipping, aviation. A trucking company facing higher fuel costs doesn't stop moving goods, it raises its rates, passes the cost down the supply chain, and keeps rolling. Airlines keep flying. Ships keep sailing. In the short term, there is simply no substitute for oil. The entire infrastructure of modern civilization was built around it, and you cannot pivot away in weeks. History confirms this again and again. The 1973 OPEC embargo cut supply by roughly 5%, and oil prices eventually quadrupled. In 2008, oil briefly hit $147 a barrel and global demand barely moved. It took a full financial crisis and deep recession to meaningfully reduce consumption. After COVID in 2021, demand roared back faster than supply could respond and prices surged before any geopolitical event. Academic research consistently places short-run oil elasticity at around -0.1, meaning a 10% drop in supply needs close to a 100% price increase to produce even modest demand reduction. The Iran conflict implied an elasticity of -0.13, nearly exactly what theory predicts. The CEO of ExxonMobil publicly argued prices should be even higher based on pure fundamentals. Long-run elasticity is different over years. People buy EVs, move closer to work, redesign supply chains, but a crisis measured in weeks only cares about the short run. There is also a layer of this story rarely discussed in Western coverage: the impact on the developing world. In wealthy nations, fuel is 3 to 5% of household spending. Painful, but survivable. In lower-income countries across South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America, fuel can be 10 to 20% of a household budget. A 60% spike doesn't inconvenience these families, it pushes them toward food and energy poverty. The global average price increase hides enormous human suffering distributed very unequally. So the math explains the price spike, but it doesn't explain why markets were slow to react at first. That comes down to commodity traders, the fallible, influential actors who bet on future oil prices using physical purchases and futures contracts. If traders collectively believe prices will rise, they rush to buy physical oil, contracting supply in the short term and making that belief a self-fulfilling prophecy. In the opening days of the war, the market was strangely calm. The US-Israeli strike began on Saturday, February 28th. By Monday, prices had risen just 6%. Tuesday, under 5%. Wednesday was flat even as insurance policies were being canceled and drone strikes were hitting ships. Traders believed the conflict would be limited and short based on Trump's initial statement, implying a contained military operation. The administration had kept prior campaigns in Venezuela, Syria, and Iran limited. Traders took them at their word. Then reality intervened. Every major marine insurer simultaneously canceled war risk insurance policies, which by rule can be canceled with just 72 hours notice. A very large crude carrier is worth $80 to $130 million, its oil cargo worth as much again. Ship owners cannot self-insure against that risk. With policies canceled, it became bureaucratically impossible for oil to leave the Gulf regardless of whether ships could physically navigate. When insurers started writing new policies weeks later, war risk premiums had risen tenfold from 0.1 to 0.25% of ship value per journey to around 3%, a cost that will not drop quickly now that hypothetical threats have become real ones. As March progressed, the market fully absorbed the reality of the disruption. Even as pipeline routes ramped up and the supply contraction shrank, prices held near $100 a barrel. For every barrel that came back online, growing concern about the conflict's length pushed sentiment in the other direction. The illusion of Gulf stability built over decades of rising wealth and apparent geopolitical insulation was permanently shattered. Iran proved it could shut down the entire region's economy overnight. Markets will price that uncertainty for years, until the Strait of Hormuz is no longer essential to global oil logistics. Its uncertain future means the world will keep paying more at the pump. This matters beyond just pump prices. Oil doesn't just power cars, it's embedded in nearly everything modern economies produce. Petrochemicals from oil are the building blocks of plastics, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, synthetic fabrics, and thousands of industrial inputs. When oil prices rise 60%, those cost increases ripple through every supply chain on Earth. Food gets more expensive to grow, package, and ship. Construction slows as material costs rise. Manufacturing margins compress. Central banks face the uncomfortable choice of raising interest rates to fight oil-driven inflation, even as higher rates slow the very economic activity that would otherwise absorb the shock. The Strait of Hormuz, in other words, is not just a shipping lane. It is a pressure valve for the entire global economy. When it closes, everything gets more expensive, not just fuel. What happens next depends on factors that remain deeply uncertain. A negotiated end to the conflict could reopen the strait within weeks, allowing insurance costs to normalize and tanker traffic to resume. But the memory of the closure would linger in markets for years, baked into a permanent risk premium on Gulf oil. Alternatively, a prolonged conflict or further escalation could see pipeline capacity fully maxed out, insurance costs climb even higher, and the global economy forced into a slow structural adjustment away from Gulf oil dependence. Either way, the world that existed before February 28, where Gulf oil was quietly assumed to flow freely and cheaply, is gone. What replaces it will be defined by the decisions made in the weeks and months ahead.